Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week, the pink eye is spreading across parts of Asia, and unfortunately it's not the virus zombie kind. There is a new Tik Tok trend involving carrots as a tanning product. Orcas have been killed by a surprising sea creature, giving some merit to the story of the lion and the mouse. The spider venom is being used as a alternative to Viagra, despite its other applications that are perhaps less desirable for the average male. One of the brightest objects in the night sky has become a satellite rather than a star or the moon itself, and in news related to the moon, scientists have confirmed what's inside of it, and sadly, no, it is not cheese. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found below. Starting with pink eye and the epidemic sweeping across Asia. Pink eye is a viral disease in this case, and as such it can be spread with relative ease, unfortunately. This is well known now in parts of India, Pakistan and Vietnam. Due to the heat wave and incredible rainfall related to it, there has been an increase in the pathogen's lifespan and the amount of pathogen available. Due to that, there is an increased risk of infection. Unfortunately, that increased risk is, translating into a real risk and real infection. Understand that we're not talking about a handful or so of cases spread around here and there. Rather, we're talking about something like 13,000 new cases in a single day at one point. Yeah. Admittedly, this was a peak in September, but nonetheless, the entire month saw 86,000 cases. Just about every school class has had half a dozen or so students infected, which means there's a great risk of every other student being infected as a result. Vietnam's not much better, although admittedly it is an improvement, where rather than being 83,000 cases in 1 month, it's about 63,000 cases over roughly 7 to 8 months. The challenge for many people, and particularly countries as a whole, is that unlike bacterial pink eye, viral pink eye survives in the environment for up to a month, and given the recent environmental conditions, they are ideal for the virus to survive and spread in that same time frame. This means that very quickly, if you touch a contaminated surface, for example, something someone has coughed on or otherwise somehow managed to get the virus onto, and then it's wet, someone else may inadvertently touch the same wet surface, and now you have contamination. If you then proceed to touch your eye, you now have pink eye.
Very interesting.
What is it, Doc?
Well, your temperature is only 55 degrees, you have no pulse, no heartbeat, and your eyes are all puffy and sticky.
Oh no, you mean...
Yeah, I'm afraid the two of you have pink eye. I'd give you topical medicine, but I don't want to touch you.
Oh, I'm so hungry and all I can think about eating is brains.
Yeah, well, for God's sake, don't touch your eyes. I'll prescribe some antibiotics.
The concern with this is, to be quite blunt, there is no cure. You really are just stuck waiting it out for, up to 4 weeks in extreme cases, although the average is about 2. This then means that there's no cure, there is a significant risk of damage to the eye because of it, and there is a massive number of infections. This means that there is a good chance a portion of the population is going to have long-term vision problems. The latter long-term vision issues being particularly more prevalent in children who are especially vulnerable. Now that nobody's thinking of the children, let's move to somewhat more optimistic news and the Nobel Prize winners for this year. Although overall, the Nobel Prize is pretty much a prestige prize at this stage rather than a particularly useful prize to be awarded, it's nonetheless a good way to recognize those who have done good things. In this instance, one of the winners is a researcher behind the COVID-19 vaccine. This is Dr. Drew Weissman from the University of Pennsylvania. Along with their fellow researcher, Dr. Katlin Kariko, they have been responsible for a large part of the mRNA background for the vaccines that have been used to so pretty much effectively address COVID-19, although the caveat to that is that their work has effectively addressed COVID-19, the rollout and implementation has not, so bear that in mind. The conversation provides considerably more background on not only who they are, but the work they've done, and everything around that. So it is a good opportunity to read up on one of the recipients, if not both the recipients, of, the Nobel Prize this year for medicine. However, you may find that other recipients are more of interest to you. The chances of that are low, given that it seems the current trends are a sign that humanity is not only stupid, but likely on its way to destroying itself. The Tik Tok trend using carrots to tan.
I was playing golf and my cleats got stuck. It hurt a little, but I kept playing. The next morning I could barely stand up. Well, you're smiling, so I take it that means this isn't serious. What are you doing?
Painkillers.
Oh, for you, for your leg.
No, because they're yummy. You want one? Make your back feel better. Fortunately, you have a deeper problem. Your wife is having an affair.
What?
You're orange, you moron. It's one thing for you not to notice, but if your wife hasn't picked up on the fact that her husband has changed colors, she's just not paying attention. By the way, do you consume just a ridiculous amount of carrots and megadose vitamins? Carrots turn you yellow, the niacin turns you red. Find some figure paint and do the math. And get a good lawyer.
Why anybody relies on TikTok for any kind of life advice or help, and not just look at it for funny videos, is mind-boggling. Especially when there are people trying to sell the idea of using carrots to alter your skin tone, which isn't an unrealistic expectation, but why is the question. Carrots are full of a pigment called carotenoids. These are basically a reddish-orangey product in them. They can be used as a stain for food, paint, and other things, but once you get them in the human body, it's slightly different. When they're in the human body, they're not used as is. Instead, they get converted into retinol. This is basically vitamin A. Vitamin A will turn you orange if you consume enough. But just remember that it's enough and you're consuming a lot of a very specific vitamin. The challenge in this case is that rather than the vitamin A that we're familiar with, we're talking about a precursor molecule in carrots. That precursor molecule needs to be converted into vitamin A, and by itself it is a problem. The issue here is that in order to convert the vitamin A precursor into vitamin A, not only are you consuming a lot of it, but the process by which it's converted is slow. That slow conversion can lead to toxicity. Yes, it is unlikely to happen, but remembering you're both consuming vitamin A in a relatively raw format from the carrots, admittedly in a lesser amount, but also consuming the vitamin A precursors. So now you have two things that are going to come into play that were going to hurt your body. Admittedly, this is only a concern if you follow the ridiculous TikTok health advice, but nonetheless, that isn't the issue. The issue is that you would be consuming something in a ridiculous dose, and as with all things, dose will make the poison, and especially if you consume anything to excess. The same general rule applies to everything in life, whether it's water, salt, or even oxygen. Anything to excess can cause problems. In a further skin-related news, we have a development in an Australian seaweed. Specifically, a seaweed that is said to be able to improve the collagen content of your skin. This is a bold claim. As a general rule, collagen content within the skin is generally regulated by the body's ability to, produce the collagen from available resources that you have provided it with. But it also only does so to a certain extent. This is why over time people develop wrinkles. Those wrinkles in your skin are where collagen replacement is not able to keep up with the loss of collagen, leading to a slow but sure loss of collagen and development of voids that are otherwise known as wrinkles. This is where the seaweed is said to be able to help somewhat with anti-aging properties, and this could be a questionable finding. The first reason to question this finding is very simply that they've not actually tested it in humans. Rather, they've been testing it in a cell model to see what the cell model would do, and that's where they claim these results from. The other concern with this study, other than it being purely cell-based, the results claimed, theoretically possible anyway, that it could prevent aging are only halfway there. Yes, you do need collagen to help with skin, and particularly with avoiding wrinkles, but you need a second product in order for that to work properly. The second product being elastin. Elastin is what gives the area under the skin a degree of firmness. As its name would indicate, it is an elastic-like compound, and so it pulls everything tightly together, thereby preventing sagging and similar. Without both the collagen and elastin, you won't get the results that are desired, and previous research along similar lines has been, less than successful to say the least. In other news that will make you disappointed, an orca has died by the least of likely creatures, otters.
That's the most foul, cruel and bad-tempered rodent you ever set eyes on.
You tit! I saw my arm and I was so scared.
Look, that rabbit's got a vicious streak a mile wide. It's a killer.
Get stuffed.
He'll do you a treat, mate.
Specifically, it took 7 otters to take down one orca, but given the size difference, that's not actually a bad trade. What appears to have happened, and rather surprisingly, is that a Russian orca died after consuming 6 otters whole, and while trying to consume the 7th otter, it became stuck in their throat, and unfortunately, once stuck there, it was unable to either eat, or more importantly, it would appear be able to function properly, slowly dying, and this is why its remains were found off the Russian coast in 2020. While by no means would otter be our choice of final meal, it's certainly an interesting and unusual option, particularly given that the predation by orcas on otters has previously been relatively unknown. They have been suspected as having involvement in a number of incidents, notably decreases in the otter population around the Bering Strait and particularly Alaska, but there was no direct evidence pointing out that this was a behavior that was regular or common, until now. The orca may have deserved it though, given their other behaviors, although this time not so far north. In the Pacific Ocean, they appear to be, engaging in roughhousing and bullying of porpoises, to the extent that porpoises die, which isn't quite so bad as some high school bullying is, but certainly getting to that point. The bizarre thing here is that there's no reason for it, and, certainly no obvious reason, and observing their behavior doesn't elucidate any further reason why they would, which is weird. Normally, animals have a reason for what they do, whether it is territorial defense, trying to get food, or that they're horny. All of the above are, if not rational, at least understandable reasons as to why they behave in the manner that they will. But this isn't so much so. Between 1962 and 2020, there have been more than 78 instances observed where the phenomena has occurred, and this is leading people to figure out what's going on here, or at least try to figure out what's going on here. The behavior includes pushing porpoises along with their nose, holding the porpoise in their mouth, or balancing the porpoises above the water. In some instances, they've also slapped the porpoise with their tail, or raked them with their teeth, causing damage. In rare occasions, they really do take after high school bullying by playing past the porpoise, by literally throwing them between the members of a pod of orcas. For now, there are 3 theories going on as to why the orcas are behaving this way. One is, to be quite blunt, a cruel form of play, and that the orcas may be deriving pleasure from tormenting the porpoises, or through the group cohesion that is involved in that. The next is possibly practice, specifically hunting practice. And the final theory is that, well, the orcas are killing with kindness, as they think they're caring for them. Going from animals being cruel to other animals to what is arguably a possibility of humans being rather cruel to other humans, but for the purposes of trying to do good things. It's the use of the Brazilian wandering spider, Phoneturia nigriventa, venom, to act in lieu of Viagra. Now, this isn't necessarily bad. Repurposing and, well, discovering bioproducts aren't a novel idea at all. Instead, the issue here is that the venom itself can cause a penile necrosis, which, for most men, probably has them grabbing at their crotch right now. Yeah, something that can quite literally cause your penis to die and fall off can somehow have the same effect as Viagra. Although it sounds crazy, it's not as weird as it might seem at first glance. The issue here is dose. In very small doses, it could have a function similar to Viagra, although it will need a lot of work before it gets there. In larger doses, yeah. You can imagine what happens. Brazilian researchers from the Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais were able to make a synthetic version of the molecule that is responsible, or is effectively, the venom. The difference being, because they've synthesized it, they can modify the molecule in certain ways. And part of that modification is, well, first of all, to make it less dangerous to the genitals of the recipient, but more importantly, turning it into a gel. Although, admittedly, the nature of the research, and surely the researchers involved, was somewhat special. They applied the gel to the groin of the animals involved and triggered erections. It certainly takes a special kind of researcher to willingly, and make it a very publicly known activity, to spread something on an animal's groin to get a reaction like that. Nonetheless, it was important to get that reaction, primarily to understand what was going on, and it appears to be, in a manner of speaking, very similar to Viagra and what's happening. Where with Viagra, you get vasodilation and vasoconstriction in parts of the body, leading to the little blue pill's common usage. This is going to use nitric oxide, which again does something very similar. It increases blood flow to the genitals of the individual, where Viagra relies heavily on sensitivity to partly nitric oxide, more importantly interferes with movement of blood in the body and as a result blood pressure. This isn't so much the case with it, and that's important. With an older individual, or those with heart disease, hypertension and so on, if they were to take Viagra, they may have some rather permanent repercussions. This novel drug wouldn't necessarily represent the same risks or threats. Given that there have been clinical trials and there are further clinical trials planned, it doesn't appear that the drug at this point in time is causing penile necrosis as the venom does, which is certainly good news. Moving from good news in terms of clinical trials to surprising news, we're already getting surprising results from the samples returned from Bennu. This is the asteroid that NASA got samples from during a very long round trip, and it's only been a week since it arrived, if not less. The reason we have good news, and surprisingly good news, is that the canister returned to Earth actually had more dust on it and in it than expected. This means that they're able to get more material than anticipated. And not only did the sample coat the inside of the canister, but also the outside of the sample collection head, and as a result, when they're trying to disassemble it and make sure they get as much material as possible, well, it's kinda hard. You can't just pull this thing apart like a regular canister. You have to carefully dismantle it to get every last possible gram of material. In further news about objects in space, we have a problem this time, which is that a satellite is now the brightest object in the night sky, or at least one of the brightest. And naturally, this is undesirable as it interferes with a number of observations of what's going on. After all, unless you know where things are and what they are, you can't attribute the appropriate measurements to them. For example, we only knew that Venus and other planets were planets not that long ago. Before then, they were considered just bright points of light in the sky. We could track them and observe them, but we had no idea what they were. Although we did give them names, hence why Venus is named Venus. But this is the issue here. The problem isn't new by any stretch of the imagination. Not that long ago, SpaceX had exactly the same issue with their satellite arrays. Because there were so many satellites and they were reflecting light in a very bad manner, they were interfering with all kinds of things, and that led to huge press coverage issues. Following from that, however, they have taken steps to mitigate the effect, and as such, at least, well, they're fixing their actions, and certainly performing better than other companies are. And that's where the Blue Walker 3, a prototype produced by the US-based AST Space Mobile, is a problem. They want to do exactly the same thing, but they don't appear to have any intention at this stage of taking any steps to mitigate the impact of their array of satellites. The same satellite has generated other issues as well, one of which is that, well, it's 4 times brighter than the recommendations made by the International Astronomical Union's Dark and Quiet Skies 2 report. The other is that it took 4 days for it to be listed in public satellite catalogues. This means that for 4 days it was effectively an unknown and, until something happened, undetected hazard for ground operators trying to get satellite paths set up and thereby prevent collisions. This will not only have destroyed Blue Walker 3, but it would also have destroyed whatever satellite that was actually doing things properly. It will be interesting to know if there were penalties attached to the slow activities, where there has been a similar, and certainly a first of kind, a fine issued to a company for a similar satellite-related screw-up. In this case, a failure to properly remove space debris after they launched their own satellite. This is when due to a TV company failing to deorbit, as it is called, their launch system for the satellite. The satellite being called EchoStar 7 and was deployed in 2002. This means that for 20 years they've been working on how to deal with this. Or perhaps we should more accurately say they've had 20 years to figure out how to deal with this, and they still managed to screw it up. The issue here is that after 20 years in orbit, the satellite had basically come to its end of life, and the simple solution to this is basically to throw it back into the atmosphere and let it burn up. They didn't do that. Rather than rely on the slow but gradual fall to Earth that would be involved in moving it into the right level of the atmosphere, and the fall to Earth being what would burn it up, which is somewhere around 300 kilometers above Earth, they instead chose to drop it down to 120 kilometers due to a lack of fuel. This is a big problem, as the lower it is, the less time it spends in the atmosphere, the less it will burn up properly. Because it doesn't burn up properly, you now have a very fast-moving, very heavy, and generally relatively solid metal thing coming crashing to Earth. The downside is that, well, given that the company responsible decided to contest it, it was ultimately settled, and the settlement was a mere $150,000. And given how much the cost of satellites are to deploy, this is basically pocket change out of their program. In further space news, we have, well, ideas about what the moon is made of. And the research is somewhat old now, being about 6 or so months ago, but the importance of it is that it largely settles about what the inner parts of the moon are made from, and is it a solid or molten core. This is somewhat important, as if we want to build moon bases and similar, having a good idea about how the moon is structured and how it's working is very important. In this case, they're able to find that the moon is largely made up of what it is, by using acoustic waves. The acoustic waves come from the quakes that go through the moon on a regular basis. Other than the sound involved, which tells us that it does have at least an outer molten core, the researchers then went and used data from the lunar laser ranging experiments, and they're able to get an idea about how much the moon deforms as it interacts with Earth due to gravity. The variation in distance from the Earth, the density of the moon, and so on, allows them to get an idea with models as to what the inner parts of the moon are like, and importantly, what they're made from. What they observed adds considerable credence to the theory that the inner core of the moon is completely molten, as it would be the most reasonable and realistic way, based on their model, to explain the movement of material within the mantle. That is, the movement of denser material into the center due to gravity, and the movement of less dense material outwards towards the mantle. The movement of the molecules and the nature of the movement leads the researchers to believe that it is about the equivalent density to iron, at somewhere around 7,822 kilograms per cubic meter. Given the number of countries planning to return to the moon in the very near future, there is a good chance that using seismological testing on site, we can actually prove these theories directly, rather than having to rely on more vicarious measurements. The final news we have for you this week is still on the moon, but this time looking to the future rather than trying to figure out what's going on in the past and present. It's the plan to put a radio telescope on the moon in roughly 2025. Although this does sound rather optimistic, let's say. The idea is by 2025, NASA's Artemis 3 mission will land astronauts on the moon. When they do so, the hope is that they'll be able to send a coalition of astronauts, Americans, Europeans, Canadians, Japanese, and a number of other countries. The hope is that when the Artemis project arrives, they're going to have a number of advantages, and most specifically the Artemis base camp. This is going to be in orbit of the moon itself, and in theory, it's going to act very much like the International Space Station, except in this case it's the International Lunar Research Station. The creative naming aside, it does have advantages that are simply not possible in or around Earth. The biggest is going to be that, well, there's no terrestrial interference on the far side of the moon. The dark side of the moon, other than being full of giant killer robots, is importantly going to have zero interference from radio signals. This means that if you set up a radio astronomy center there, you get to find a lot of details that you just can't get anywhere else at the moment, or at least not with any reasonable chance of accessing in the next 50 years. Of course, hoping that said research station does not develop any sense of sentience, given that it's going to be abandoned on the far side of the moon for 18 months, listening to the empty void of space to see what's there. And if you know anything about what's going on in space, when you listen to the dark void for long enough, you begin to hear things that you probably shouldn't be hearing, or something along those lines according to Nietzsche. The other advantage that it has is that because the moon is largely tidally locked with Earth, there are 2 weeks where it sees zero light on one side of the moon. As a result, it gets the effective benefit of having zero interference from Earth and zero interference from the Sun, and that is a long time frame to be able to get completely clean data that has zero sense of interference, and you would hopefully be able to detect only what you want to be able to detect. The whole idea, though, is not without some major challenges, largely challenges that would need to be overcome before the project was even deployed, as once the system's in place, and without any humans on hand to do anything about it, the system has to be completely independent. The biggest challenges are going to be twofold. One is the temperature fluctuation. During the daytime, temperatures get to 120 degrees Celsius, or 250 freedom units. At night, it's negative 173 degrees Celsius, or negative 280 freedom units. The second is actually getting all the equipment there. The antenna itself needs to be 6 meters tall or about 20 feet. It's a question we have as to whether or not the Berkeley researchers involved with this are trying to recreate some of the features of Mars. Admittedly, perhaps not the most popular features of Mars, but still. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.